Hi everyone, welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political news show. We have a lot to cover, so I want to get right into it. We have had some economic news, some Ukraine news, congressional news, and some news about tariffs that I want to get into. On Friday, the president met with Zelenskyy at the White House to sign a minerals deal. This was supposed to pay back the aid that we have given to Ukraine. However, the deal collapsed when the Vice President J.D. Vance, Zelenskyy, and Trump got into a shouting match in front of the world's press. I'm going to run you through the exchange, which you can find on the internet. It started, at least what I could see, was J.D. Vance suggested that diplomacy was the way forward because military might was not going to work against Russia. And I do agree with Vance. But Zelenskyy disagreed, saying Russia has violated previous agreements, which is true. That is a fair statement. Zelenskyy then said that Putin took Crimea a decade ago and nobody stopped him. That is also true. Obama did nothing to stop him. Zelenskyy indicated that the war has actually been going on since 2014. Basically, there are pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine since 2014 that have been fighting the Ukrainian government. Basically, Ukraine has been in a civil war this whole time. Zelenskyy said a ceasefire was agreed to in 2019, and European leaders assured Zelenskyy that Putin would not go any further, which we know was broken in 2022, 3 years ago. A prisoner swap was also violated, according to Zelenskyy. I have a feeling this is true. I don't see why it wouldn't be. So he asked Vance what kind of diplomacy would work. Well, I know my answer. We would have to negotiate a peace deal, and this is what I would do if I was in front of Putin. I would say you get to pick 2 out of 3 things. You get to pick. You can't take all 3. You can take 1, but you can take 2. You get 2. The 3 options are Ukraine stays out of NATO, you get the territory in Ukraine you already occupy, and you get an assurance that NATO will not expand anymore. I would say, as I said, you get to pick 2 out of 3. If you want the land you already have, then Ukraine will join NATO. If you want Ukraine out of NATO, then you must pull out of all the land you currently occupy. If you don't want NATO to expand anymore, then Ukraine will still join NATO and you must withdraw your troops. You get 2 of the, I hope that makes sense. Maybe I didn't explain that very well. But you get 2 out of the 3. I hope that makes sense. If he disagrees, then I would suggest that we abandon talks with Russia and we just continue to provide more aid to Ukraine. As I've said on this show for many, many months, I am done aiding Ukraine. I want to see this war end at almost any cost. If we go in all on helping Ukraine beat Russia, which is not what I hope we have to do, then that's the path that we need to commit, and I don't see Trump doing that. I do admit this is not a perfect plan that I've come up with, but it is the current plan, the Biden plan, just shoveling more money into this conflict is not working, and it is way too expensive. So it's not my preferred option. So what did the vice president say? J.D. Vance said, Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come to the Oval Office to try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys have a lot of, you've been forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president, referring to Trump, for trying to bring an end to this conflict. That is true. Everything J.D. Vance said is true. Zelenskyy fired back, saying that Vance has never been to Ukraine. And by the way, Zelenskyy has his arms crossed here, if you watch this exchange, and Vance has his finger pointed at Zelenskyy, and Trump is doing his stupid pose with his legs spread all the way out and his hands in between him, forming a V shape. And Vance replied that the people who go to Ukraine are put on a propaganda tour. So my guess is that Trump will not be going to Ukraine, and neither will J.D. Vance. Vance continued. Zelenskyy said that we have an ocean between us, and that we don't have any problems, referring to problems with Russia right now, but we will one day. And then Trump joined in and said, you don't know that. Believe it or not, I agree with Trump on this one. He said, don't tell us what we're going to feel. He said that twice. You are in no position to dictate what we are going to do. We are going to feel very good and very strong. By the way, here's a good note. If somebody uses the word very multiple times in a sentence, it shows they don't have a very good vocabulary. Just throwing that out there. Obviously, this is set up. This was a setup. Love him or hate him, Zelenskyy was set up and he was humiliated. If it wasn't obvious before, it should be now. We are not on Ukraine's side anymore. To give credit to Zelenskyy, he didn't take it lying down, but I have a feeling there's not going to be a peace deal in Ukraine. It doesn't seem like that. And J.D. Vance kind of threw more salt in the wound when he said, have you said thank you once this entire meeting? You went to Pennsylvania in October to campaign for the opposition. You have not offered words of appreciation for the United States of America and for the president who is trying to save your country. Trump clearly stated you are not winning this. Trump also said it's going to be very hard to do business like this. Later on, Trump, I'm assuming this was him, he posted on Truth Social, and I saw it on Instagram. He basically blew the whole thing up. He said, quote, "We have had a very meaningful meeting in the White House today. Much was learned and that could never be understood without our conversation under such pressure. It's amazing what comes out through emotion, and I have determined that President Zelenskyy is not ready for peace if America is involved, because he feels that our involvement gives him a big advantage in negotiations. I don't want advantage, I want peace." That's the end of the quote there. As I said, this was a setup. I believe when I read the reports, it didn't sound nearly as bad as I thought it was, and I think I'm making it sound better by reading it to you. I really think you should listen to it. When I watched it, I couldn't believe how badly this went. Of course, there are many details that I missed here. There was some shouting. It was hard to understand. So I encourage you to listen to it. If I was a politician, many of these times in situations like this, I would just get up and leave. But Zelenskyy can't do that. He's the one that's asking for aid, not the other way around. On Sunday, which is at the day I'm recording this, and yesterday as you're listening to this, European leaders met in London to try to draw up a game plan for Ukraine after this huge blow-up. Clearly, Europe is rattled. Keir Starmer, the UK PM, met with Zelenskyy, but is still clearly trying to maintain ties with the Americans, stating that he believes that Trump still wants peace in Ukraine. And I believe that too. I think Trump wants peace in Ukraine. I just don't know how he wants it to go through. I just question his method of getting there. Starmer suggested that Macron, the president of France, could act as a mediator between Trump and Zelenskyy, but I don't think this is really going to work. I think Trump seems to have his mindset. Whatever way he wants to go seems to be the way that we're going to go. He's not helping Zelenskyy unless Zelenskyy concedes quite a lot of ground, both literally and figuratively. What does this mean for the future? Well, as I've said a lot already, I think this war could end soon, and not because of a peace deal. Without U.S. aid, it seems that Ukraine is going to collapse. Europe does not have the defense capacity to keep Ukraine up and running. Their aid has been mostly keeping the lights on in Ukraine, which is keeping the government running. But in the meantime, it seems that Europe's going to do everything they can to keep Ukraine fighting. Starmer announced a £1.6 billion plan, which is about $2 billion, to provide air missiles, and it appears from media reports that Starmer is going to try to lead a coalition of the willing, his words, to police any deal in Ukraine. So it seems like Europe is trying to step up here, but as I said, I don't think they have the capacity to do that. Perhaps the UK will take a lead on any future plans with this conflict, and the Americans, be a secondary or tertiary actor. This certainly was the most eventful news of the week. However, there is other news. Here at home, and possibly most importantly for us Americans, the U.S. economy remains in a very perilous situation. I was going to lead with this until the Ukraine drama, and that's so often how this goes, is I plan to talk about something at the beginning of the show, and then something else overtakes it. The Consumer Confidence Bureau, which measures economic confidence, registered the largest drop in the month of February since 2021, when the inflation crisis began. Frankly, I don't blame the economic state, but blame people, because the economic state we have been in the last 5 years. The study states, views of the current labor market conditions have weakened. Consumers have become more pessimistic about future business conditions and less optimistic about future income. The report also stated, pessimism about future employment prospects worsens and reach a 10-month high. Now, why is this important? Well, to put it simply, people who feel that the economy will be worse off later tend to spend less money now and save more money because they're concerned about losing their jobs in the future. Less spending means less people buying, which means less revenue for businesses, and that means job layoffs. So ironically, the fear of a recession can create the recession that people feared, just like shortages. People go out and panic buy because they're afraid of a shortage, they can create a shortage. Do I think we are headed for a recession? I think we are almost certainly going to slow down, with living standards of Americans being eaten away. Even Walmart showed their earnings report showed they are concerned about future growth and expect sales drops in the future. And they are the largest retailer in the country, other than maybe Amazon. I saw two different reports. One report said that people expect inflation to be 6%, and another one said 4.3%. Either way, people are expecting inflation to be higher for longer, and I do too. I think inflation is going to be about 4% in the future, for the foreseeable future, but as of right now, it is about 3%. Why might people be feeling this way? Well, in my opinion, it's the tariffs. And this kind of goes into what we were talking about earlier, and I'm going to kind of come back to tariffs later, but what I'm going to say is President Trump said that tariffs on Canada and Mexico will begin in early March, and that's as of this recording. That might have changed between now and when you listen to it. Of course, the administration does not feel this way. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, warned about slow economic growth but blamed it on the Biden administration, saying the economy has become too reliant on government spending and we need a more diverse economy through tax cuts, deregulations, and tariffs. Now, this is the Republican playbook. This is the Bush, Reagan, and Nixon playbook. Now, I agree, a more diverse economy is a good idea, and I think in abstract, most people would agree with that too. Do I agree with the methods? Not so much. But that aside, government spending is actually 15% higher now than it was at this time in 2024, according to the U.S. Treasury. Then that's hilarious to me, because I said in the last episode, DOGE has cut almost no money from the federal budget. And government spending is now higher than it was under Biden. And of course, Trump hasn't signed any federal spending bills yet. He'll have to do that by the end of next week. But it shows that we haven't seen really many tangible gains so far. If anything, they're losses. So to put it lightly, consumers aren't happy, DOGE isn't accomplishing what it wants, and I don't think we're headed in a great direction. On the bright side, I am more optimistic about the long-term economy. I've been saying this for years, even back in 2022. I said surely by 2025 we'll be back to normal, but I guess I was wrong. I feel that by 2027, maybe 28, inflation will be back to normal and interest rates will be a bit lower. But is that going to be enough time for the next election? I don't know. I mean, that would be just before, but will consumers be happy about it? As someone graduating this year, I certainly hope we're not heading into a recession. One of my friends, Joe, who I've had on the show before, sent me a couple of something over the weekend conducted by the Atlanta Fed, suggested that real GDP growth is expected to drop 1.5% in the first quarter. Now, we don't know this because the first quarter isn't over yet. I assume this is based on projections, and we don't know the official numbers until the end of April. But this is an alarming report because 1.5% is not an insignificant number. Lastly, I want to talk about some tax cuts news, or actually there's going to be more, but I want to talk about some tax cuts news. I talked about this a bit in the previous episode, but now we have had a tax cutting resolution that has been passed. To be clear, the tax cuts themselves are not passed, they are just being proposed. The resolution is basically just an outline. There's still a lot that needs to be changed, but this is where we are now. The goal is to cut no more than $4.5 trillion in taxes over the next 10 years, which is $450 billion a year. And remember, we already run a deficit of $2 trillion, so now we would be up to nearly $2.5. Anyway, extending Trump's tax cuts would be 4 out of $4.5 trillion. Another report said $4.7 trillion. I don't know which is the case, but either way, it's expensive. Then there's the whole other plan. Trump wants no taxes on overtime, no taxes on tips, and no taxes on Social Security. And let me just throw in here, somebody pointed this out to me and said, if we had no taxes on overtime, what's to stop big executives from dropping their wages down to $7.25 an hour with guaranteed overtime and then make $1 million an hour overtime? They would pay no taxes, or basically none. So that's a huge loophole that they're going to get through. So no taxes on overtime is a terrible, terrible, terrible idea. Hopefully the verdict is clear. These tax cuts are too expensive, we can't afford them, and we certainly cannot afford them now. As I said 8 years ago, I'm saying it again, we cannot afford to extend these tax cuts. But Republicans put themselves in a bind, because if we don't extend them, then they're going to be raising taxes, and Democrats can use that in the next election. But if they extend them, our debt problems will only be worse in the foreseeable future. I'm also not going to rant about tipping, as I could do that all day, but let me just say that cutting taxes on tips is unlikely to help low-income people because many of them don't pay federal taxes already. So the real way to help them is to raise their wages, not cutting their taxes. But I know Republicans won't back raising the minimum wage. to any amount higher than it already is. Adding these tax cuts all together would cost about $7 to $11 trillion in over 10 years. We just can't do it. Even if we could cut $2 trillion in spending, it still couldn't be done. And by the way, cutting $2 trillion would mean that we'd have to cut Social Security, Defense, Medicare, and Medicaid. Needless to say, I'm concerned about the future of the country's finances and the economy, but I do have some good news. The tax cut resolution was only passed 217 to 215. The Senate has also said they will make changes. The resolution, as I said earlier, is just a goal. It's not actual law. They need to finalize it, and that could lose many Republican votes. Then there's a whole separate issue. We are facing a government shutdown in less than 2 weeks. The last deal, passed with Democrat support, only lasts until March 14th, which is 11 days away. This time, Democrats are floating the idea that the only way they would support funding the government again is if Republicans agree to limit Elon's Doge access, which Republicans will not accept. It looks that once again we are going to head into a government shutdown, although we'll know more next week. If you're new to politics or just confused, as I'm sure some of you are, what do you want to take away from this episode? Well, 1, the U.S. is clearly not supporting Ukraine anymore. 2, the domestic economy remains weak. And 3, our government keeps pushing low-tax nonsense with no plan to pay for it. Lastly, tariffs, and I promise we're almost done. Trump has extended them until March. Extended the break. Then he suggested extending them to April. Then said that now it said they're going to go into effect on March 4th, which is tomorrow. The ones on China already went into effect, and now Trump is threatening another 10% for China. Canada and Mexico, for their part, are stepping up on drug enforcement, and the Mexican economy minister has said he's working with the U.S. Commerce Secretary, and Justin Trudeau is working with us as well. Of course, this is a huge disruption to business. Many of them were able to deal with 10%, but 20% is a whole another problem. And if you don't know, profit margins, they vary based on industry, but they can be as little as, like in the grocery industry, as little as like 2%. And so they're going to have to pass this on to us. And I think you Democrats out there are going to agree with me on this. It's funny that the same people that claim to be pro-business and state let low taxes and low regulations help businesses also want to raise trade barriers and taxes on businesses. And what an absolute mess this has become. And let me put this into perspective. Imagine we were making plans to go out to dinner, and the day before I said, let's go do this. Then a few hours later I said, no, we're going to do this. Then we're going to do this. Nah, let's do this instead. And every couple of hours I kept changing it. And then like right before we were going to go out, I said, let's just go out another day. And then I did the same thing all over again. That's what it's like to be a business right now. They don't know how to plan for the future because the plan keeps changing. And as a person, I hate when people do that. And I think most people hate that too. And that's exactly how it feels to be a business right now. So hopefully that can help help simplify it for you. I still want to stress that I don't think these tariffs are going to go into effect because it would really weaken the president's authority and his popularity. But regardless, the stress that this has put businesses under is immense. And I really hope we all learn never to do this again. But for now, we're going to have to wait and see. One more thing, and I know there's a lot. Trump will address Congress tomorrow in his joint session of Congress. If there's anything important, I will cover that in the next episode. As always, thank you for listening. Please subscribe and like, review, whatever. Share it with your friends and family. And have a great week. Bye-bye.